Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait just a few minutes before we start the program as everyone starts to join us. All right. We have a great turnout today of over 400 people that have registered. And we're also live streaming this on Facebook Live at facebook.com/RUCSRR, which is the Facebook page for the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. So again, I'll wait just a few, maybe a minute or two while people log in. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled to be hosting a brilliant author, scholar, journalist, and fellow Arab American, Massoud Hayoun. I love these lectures because I get to meet so many interesting people. The only downside is that we can't do it in person because of the pandemic, but inshallah, we will bring you to Rutgers Newark and we'll host you in person soon. Before I do the formal introduction of our guest lecturer today, I just want to introduce the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is hosting Massoud Hayoun as part of our annual lecture series. And for 2021 to 2022, the lecture series theme is Desecuritizing Muslim Identities, broadly defined. And it's consistent with CSRR's mission because we are the only civil rights center at a US law school that focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians in the United States, as well as the human and civil rights of the geopolitics, of the countries of origin from which these diasporic communities originate. Because most people who immigrate here or ancestors of immigrants, which is effectively everyone in this country except for Native Americans and African Americans, right, whose ancestors came here through forced enslavement, but we are all otherwise immigrants. And historically, whatever happens abroad in our countries of origin affects how we are treated in the US or mistreated, how our rights are protected or violated. And so the Center for Security, Race, and Rights commits itself, or its mission is to focus on those issues, both in the historically in the present and also looking to the future. So I encourage all of you, if you haven't already, join our newsletter at csrr.rutgers.edu. Follow us on Twitter right now, get your smartphones out and go to Twitter, go to Facebook and Instagram, RUCSRR. And on Instagram, it's Rutgers CSRR. And finally, for those who are able and willing, please go and donate to our center so that we can continue to provide these types of programs for free and to the general public. Just go to our CSRR.Rutgers.edu, press the donate button and give whatever you can. Okay, and my name is Sahar Aziz. I am the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. I'm also a professor of law and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers Law School at Rutgers University in Newark. And it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our keynote lecturer, our guest lecturer, Massoud Hayoun, who is a journalist and author based in Los Angeles. And he is also the author of When We Were Arabs, a Jewish family's forgotten history, which is the topic of this lecture. That book won the Arab American Book Award, which described the book, quote, as breaking new ground in Arab and Arab American identity, end quote. The book was also an NPR Best Book of the Year, among other honors that it has received. His first novel, which is a murder mystery and political allegory set in Beijing, is set to come out in May and has been called Exquisite by the iconic dissident artist Ai Weiwei. His second novel, A Jewish American Wizard of Oz, and a fictional response to When We Were Arabs, will be out in October. So this is a very prolific year for Massoud. It will be his last novel, and it has been called Massive by author Alia Muro. He has been a staff reporter and editor in China, the US, and the Middle East for outlets including AFP, Al Jazeera, CNN, and many others. And so with that, we really are very, very fortunate to have Massoud with us today. Welcome, Massoud. What I'll do is I'll let you just give maybe some opening remarks, and then we will engage in a fireside chat. And afterwards, we will open it up to the audience that can put in their questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom box. Awesome. So welcome, Massoud.
Thank you so much. I don't know why, maybe I'm a little more nervous than I've been with other such events, but I want to say before I say anything, I had at first anticipated that I would only read a small, just a sample of this book because I'm on deadline for the two novels that Professor Aziz was talking about just now, and running kind of perilously behind. And so I thought maybe I'd just dip in and just get a taste of it. It's impossible to put this book down. There are several moments that will leave you winded because they synthesize a great deal of American history, of the underpinnings of American history. You'll understand a little bit more things that kind of orbit around the subject of Islamophobia in this country, things like Japanese American internment and the exclusion of Chinese Americans from citizenship. You will understand so much more than we are taught. Those of us who had the benefit, more or less, of a US history education in high schools in this country, why this country is so as it is at home and abroad. I really am so proud that an Egyptian American wrote such a tour de force of a triumph of a book that is actionable enough to change the way that we are living right now, to change the kind of fascist trends that we're seeing in our country and in our world right now. So I really highly recommend this. I very much hope that she'll come and do talks, hopefully at Japanese American National Museum in the United States. There are a lot of people for whom this is relevant, Muslim or non-Muslim. It's a pleasure, Professor Aziz. I think that Professor Aziz's book and mine are very much in conversation. The reason why I didn't tell Professor Aziz that I had read this book in advance of this discussion was because of my anxiety, and I thought, oh, she's going to test me on this publicly and I'm going to make a fool of myself. So that's why I left it until the very last minute to tell her, actually, I finished your book very quickly. It is very accessible. Also, I want to say, because I had a conversation with a friend who is actually Muslim French and writing about Muslim French affairs. She was very interested in it, but thought, oh, it's from an academic press, it must be inaccessible to a non-academic readership. That's not at all the case. It does engage you intellectually, all books should, but it is very accessible to everyone. And for that and so many other reasons, I felt that When We Were Arabs and this book were in conversation, because even though Professor Aziz is part of academia, I think that there is very much an understanding in the way that this book is positioned, especially with the intro, which is very personal, that it belongs to everyone, that this kind of academic work belongs to everyone. And that is part of When We Were Arabs. When We Were Arabs is an alternative to whatever kind of academic monograph could exist on the histories and kind of the different political considerations or the different kind of academia that people have arrived at in asking themselves about the various Arab peoples what the late Egyptian feminist Nawal Saadawi called the Arab peoples. There's this idea that there isn't a single Arab people. There are people who became Arab over the course of history, and that is a testament to, like in the Latin American culture, the way that our culture has been open to diversity. And it's not to override the fact that there have been instances of discrimination and violent discrimination in our history, which we can come back to at different points. I think a lot of people like to weaponize that violence against different communities or that kind of oppression. Whereas if you look at Arab history, every single group, regardless of religion or sect, any kind of dissident group has faced oppression in the same way that in European societies, the world hasn't been kind of a testament to accountable government. We're still struggling with that in the United States today. So that's a large rambling way of saying both of these books intend to speak to everyday people, out of an understanding that this kind of intellectual labor that produces these works, the infinite amount of hours that it takes to go through and synthesize so much history, so much intellectual endeavor, and to produce something clear-eyed enough to actually affect people's understandings of the world, that should belong to people. That should belong to everyday people without the benefit of an education. If you've read When We Were Arabs, you know that Oscar very much wanted to be an educated person. He always dreamed that he would go to Beirut and become a doctor. That was his idea of sophistication, and it was something that he never was able to achieve because he was divorced from his country by various echelons of colonialism, and because he joined a colonial project at one point. So they were very intelligent people. My grandmother, very late in life, had revolutionary ideas watching what she found to be devastating things happening around her in the world, and wanted to leave it saying something significant and actionable. And they were everyday people who wanted to produce something that came from an intelligence that you don't get from school systems. And she wanted to do that with me. And then unfortunately she passed away 3 months into it, but she's still very much a co-author. And I know that she herself would have felt academia or knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, shouldn't be only for the people who have the privilege of not working or the privilege of tuition. And that was kind of the driving force behind When We Were Arabs. That and the 2014 assault on Gaza impressed upon us a need to move forward with an idea that we had been kind of conceptualizing for a long time in our conversations. I was living in New York at the time. I was working for Al Jazeera, and she used to call me every single day. So I would talk to her and I would smoke outside of my building, and I'm not a smoker anymore, thank goodness. And we would talk about everything that I was experiencing with other Arab American people at Al Jazeera, and asking ourselves, how different are we from other Arab American people? Why do we think that? Or why are there certain things that we think are so specific to our family or our little corner of existence that we're only Jewish Northern African people? And I say that to include Egypt, which is so often not included in North Africa, obviously. Why is everything so specific to our family? Why are so many customs that actually are very commonplace among many Arab American people with whom we could find common cause, relegated to just our family and our little kind of parochial, sequestered existence? And what would the political significance be of us asking these questions publicly in a way that is actionable? And then I started talking to a lot of people in academia, one of which said, if you ever question whether what I now happily call Jewish Arab people, if you ever question their Arabness, you'll be crucified. That was an exact quote of what this professor told me, that I would be crucified for suggesting that Jewish Arab people are Arab. And it just takes one person who doesn't care. So that's about being crucified. So I wouldn't say that I was crucified. I would say that there are quite a lot of people who are upset with what I have said. I am sure that Professor Aziz has encountered no dearth of people who are very upset with what she says. It's impossible to say anything, especially in this climate of fascism fostered by 4 years of Trump and all of the neoliberal and conservative predecessors of that moment, in this environment of false sciences and reckoning with false sciences, of us realizing that so many kind of ideas that we thought were scientifically true before are just totally false and killing people, actively killing people. So it just takes what's happening at this very exciting moment in history in so many ways, of people not caring whether they're crucified or not, of people actively questioning whether their own ideas of themselves are actively oppressing and dispossessing and colonizing people, for us to start having the conversations necessary to live in a very good world, in a very, to live a life beyond this pandemic, this Trumpist, fascist moment that we are living in. So that's my introduction to When We Were Arabs. To be out of full transparency, it was very hard to write it because I was mourning Daida. I'm still mourning Daida. These forthcoming novels are about mourning Daida and Oscar in many ways. And so I blocked a lot of it.
Right?
Yeah, my grandparents who raised me. And
So I
yeah.
wanted to kind of maybe start into asking you a few more pointed questions. And thank you for that introduction. By the way, this book is phenomenal. I was so lucky to have read it while I was in Egypt, which was somewhat fortuitous.
And moving to me, very moving to me. Thank you.
I was reading it and I was going to Cairo and seeing different places, and I even walked by the synagogue that is in downtown Cairo, and I thought, wow, it was a perfect time. And so when I was reading it, I thought to myself, why did you choose this manner to educate your readers about your Arab Jewish identity? What, in some ways, it's what inspired you to write the book, but why did you write a book that was much more of a memoir about your grandparents, as opposed to perhaps something that was maybe more policy or I wouldn't say academic per se, but journalistic? But this was a very personal way of explaining to the reader, and in a very moving way, about Arab Jewish identity through which you've experienced
it. It begins with watching ridiculous movies by the director Louis Buñuel, and movies by Youssef Chahine, if we were to use an Egyptian example. I love movies that tell a story in a very disjointed way that kind of shock you into paying more attention. I wanted this book to not have a kind of a linear structure. I wanted it to, there are 2 chapters in this book that tell the story of what life was like for my grandparents in their generation, both in what was indigenous about their surroundings and what was colonized about their surroundings. And for me, that was like a new wave film, or I had intended it as a kind of a poetic device, as a new wave film, kind of a jump cut, to say, I'm going to tell this story 2 different ways. I'm going to tell it. I need to show you 2 things. I need to show you what was still integrally tied to their home societies about my grandparents, and then what was colonized about my grandparents. And then as I go throughout, there is a bit of a chronological timeline, but it still kind of breaks off into ideas and illustrating those ideas with lives. And I thought, this is a story that is bound to upset people, even though it shouldn't be upsetting. I should be allowed to say these things without being aggressed by people on every single side of the political spectrum, which happened a lot last year. Unfortunately, there was an uptick in attention to this book during the assaults on Palestinian lives that were happening in the middle of last year. that I have divorced myself from. I don't want this book to be relevant to people solely because of its support, tangential support for Palestinian lives. It's not a book. It's not for me to tell that story, and it's not for me, God forbid, to ever profit from the kind of horror that we were seeing last year and continue to see. I wanted this story's narrative arc to look very different from other stories because I wanted people kind of like on TV, in TV about prisons, people always say you go into prison and you punch the most powerful looking person there and then you assert yourself as the alpha dog. I needed to go in and show I won't be crucified. I will tell this story in a very strange way. I'm gonna punch you. I'm gonna punch I'm gonna punch structure in the face, and you're gonna have to just be upset if you're gonna be upset, and I'm not gonna deal with that anyway. So part of it was intentional. Part of the structure was intentional, and then part of it was circumstantial. I had intended to write something very abstract with Daida, with my grandmother. And that became impossible because right after we got this contract, which it was itself a kind of an exercise in the Zionism of the US publishing industry, she passed away, and it was impossible to write this kind of co-authored book with her that would have been more of a dialogue between me and a very formidable woman. And so it became a book about mourning that I hope rings true with other people in this situation. And by other people in this situation, I don't mean Jewish Arabs. I don't mean people of Jewish faith. A lot of people assume right off that this must be a book for Jewish Arabs or a book for better understanding Jewish American culture. This is a book by and for Arab people. This is a book by and for the Arab peoples. If Arab and Arab American people read this book and see some of themselves in it, I think the act of mourning and needing to find one's relationship to other Arab people, or needing to experience lost loved ones in other people and recognizing them in small manners that are very Arab, that I couldn't even put my finger on, that I can experience with not even just Tunisian, Egyptian, or Moroccan people, with people from all over the Arab world that I have encountered in my life. And obviously that isn't to say that I've loved every single person of Arab origin that I've met in my life. Like everyone, there have been people that I can't stand, and there are people who are wonderful, but the wonder of it is that without this kind of colonized Zionist view of myself as one part of a very small part of civilization that has been perpetually victimized by everyone not in this situation, I've been allowed to see myself in other people, to see myself as part of the rest of the world. And Arabness has helped me see that. Arabness is understood in this book as a choice to belong to the Arab peoples, has allowed me to do that.
Wow, you speak in a way that is very, reflects the authenticity of the book, which certainly is something that came out to me as I was reading it. And the fact that I was reading this book while I was in Cairo made me think about Coptic Egyptians, right, that comprise 10% of Egypt. And I know that the Jewish Egyptian community used to be much larger, and we'll get to the geopolitics in a minute. And I'm a Muslim Egyptian, and so as a result, I'm definitely of the privileged group, right? My religion is the dominant group, but Coptic Egyptians, at least in my mind, and I think in the vast majority of Egyptians' minds who are Muslim, are indigenous, right? We see them as Egyptian. They have different faiths, and they're I mean, there's a saying that says they're the ones who just didn't convert to Islam because Christianity was there before Islam. Judaism was there right before Christianity and before Islam. And so it really was reminded me of kind of that intersection between culture and religion, and how one's identity is shaped when you have differences of religion within the same culture and how that creates sameness or differences. And so I kept thinking about kind of Arab identity, and I saw in what you were writing this sense of fragility or precariousness. And whether it was something you felt that your Arab identity was precarious or fragile is one thing, but also the fact that whether it's Arab Americans perhaps, or Arabs that are not Jewish, or Jews that are not Arab, questioning or challenging your identity and imposing on you an identity through which, you know, they're projecting their own values or what they think you should be. And so to be a Jewish Arab, right, or to Jewish Arab American is not something that, you know, these are not words that people usually use to describe themselves. So could you tell us more about, you know, how this book and maybe what led to it has made you think about that identity, and perhaps, you know, illuminating for our audience how we should be thinking about Jewish Arab American identity, and why is it fraught with all of these with precarity?
In our conversations before, we had discussed that there's also kind of the title "When We Were Arabs" also raises some questions. Does that Arabness no longer exist? Where do you spatially put that Arabness? I also don't think that it was very significant to my most distant ancestors, whether pre-colonial or post-colonial, whether they called themselves Arab. I think this idea of ethnicity in the way that we discuss it in the United States is very different from what their concept of themselves as regards the rest of their nation or their co-religionists or compatriots. It's very different for them. The Arabness that I describe is very much an Arabness of the future. It's very much, when we were Arabs is in the future still. It's understanding this legacy of where we're coming from and not allowing it to be tainted by a very overt effort by certain quarters of academia and publishing to twist our identities so that they can be used for the continued colonial projects that we see in our part of the world. So the Arabness that exists is one that I have needed to perpetually question and kind of come back to and ask myself, why doesn't it exist? And the reason for that precariousness is a lot more kind of tangible, very specific. It is policy documents that were written by French dignitaries who were at the onset of their colonial endeavors in Arab nations to begin with, Algeria, and then jockeying for power in places like Egypt with Britain. So there were people who envisioned that the local indigenous Jewish communities that existed in these societies would begin to see themselves as less and less integral parts of their society, and that they would occupy a certain go-between function between the rest of the indigenous populations and the occupation, the dominating elite. And that they would serve as an example of what happens when you successfully acculturate and assimilate yourself into the idea that France or Britain, or in the case of Libya, Italy, are the future, that they are progress. And so there were people in these documents who wrote very specifically, and I addressed this in When We Were Arabs at length, that over a series of generations, people in these societies would cease to view themselves as integral members of their societies. They would begin to affect Western dress, Western manners, even the way that they practiced Judaism would become completely unlike what Judaism had been before. And they succeeded because our family gradually over time became progressively Western, and progressively forgetful of anything that came before, to the extent that we don't know our own personal histories. I'm in the position, or my grandparents themselves were in the position of knowing a lot more about French history than our own personal histories or the histories of our ancestors and their relationship to the rest of the country. A lot of people, I want to come back to something else that you said before we move on, that you're part of the majority. In my experience of Arab history, with the little education in Arab history that I've allowed myself by seeking it out as somebody who was never able to obtain it in a way that I feel would have been more fair, more useful to people in society, in our education system in the United States and elsewhere. Almost everyone in Arab societies belongs to some kind of a group that has been marginalized or persecuted at some point in history. The Zionist histories of Jewish Arabs seek very specifically to write entire volumes that I was going through of just violent, discriminatory action, historical violent discriminatory action against Jewish Arab peoples, which I say Jewish Arab peoples because within the context of Egypt, Tunisia, all of these countries, there were very diverse Jewish communities. There were several Jewish communities. In the Tunisian circumstance, there were Jewish communities who had origins in Italy, in Spain, and in Portugal, who called themselves one particular name. And then there were more indigenous Tunisian communities, of which my family was a part, that called themselves Tuansa, that called themselves Tunisian people. So even at that point, they identified very integrally with their homelands. For my family in Tunisia, their holy sites are in Tunisia. Of course, there are holy sites that are central to our religion that are in occupied Palestine right now. There are holy sites far outside of the Tunisian borders, but the focal points of our religion were very much in Tunisia. The pilgrimages that they made were to Jerba, to the Ghriba synagogue that's very old, and history that is said has very important spiritual significance to Jewish Tunisians. Within the Egyptian context, it was even more cosmopolitan. There was a Syrian Egyptian Jewish community that had Syrian traditions and identified with Syrianness, that to this day very much only, I mean, I can't speak for them, but it's kind of well known. And there was even a New York Times article about how Syrian Jewish people tend to marry only with Syrian Jewish people, and they continue to speak their dialect of Arabic among themselves. There were Maghribi synagogues that my family was part of. There were synagogues devoted to the northern, because my grandfather was, I should say, from a mother who was more indigenous to Egypt than his father, and from a Moroccan father. There were Moroccan synagogues. There were Ashkenazi European synagogues for people who had very newly arrived as refugees to Egypt from the Holocaust. There were Sephardi communities who spoke Ladino, which is a Jewish dialect of the Spanish language, within that context, who were also joined by Sephardi communities from the Ottoman Empire. They had predominance. They had kind of power over the rest of the community at that time in some ways, because at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, there was a large Ladino-speaking Sephardi community. So there are a great many communities. We're taught to see only one community, and one community that faced violence and discrimination. The project of When We Were Arabs was never to say that this violence and discrimination did not exist. It's to ask what happened with that violence and discrimination, and how do we contextualize that violence and discrimination with all the other things that were happening since time immemorial with this people. My ancestors, or at least it doesn't ring true within the context of my family and so many other families that I talked to, that it was just persistent violence, bloodshed, and evil that happened to them, or I wouldn't be here. I'm proof. If it were only just darkness, I would not exist. Also, when my family left, my family's first ever immigration experience that we know of was from Morocco to Egypt. They didn't go from Morocco to Italy. They didn't go from Morocco to Spain or to France or to any of these places that are associated somehow with progressivism and the kind of minority rights that they would use as a cudgel to beat indigenous administrations over the head. My family moved to another Arab country, an Arab country that at that they didn't speak any of that language. It wasn't just out of necessity. It was my family on that left. Oh, sorry, I have a pop-up that came up. Oh, the charm of Zoom. My family left. That part of my family was originally Tamazight speaking. So they spoke the so-called Berber language. Berber is a pejorative term for Imazighen, the Amazigh peoples. They initially spoke that language, and they spoke their own Moroccan dialect of Arabic, which my grandfather still spoke with my great-grandfather, which is a thing that I didn't know, by the way, until I allowed myself to go back to North Africa. There were words that come from Darija, from the Moroccan Arabic language, that my grandfather always used, that I thought he just came up with because my grandfather was a very kind of percussive man. Like if we were eating at the dinner table, he would be playing his little darbuka on the dinner table. He'd make up little words, like he'd always say like gagoon meant cookie to my grandfather. And it's not from any language, it's not from any, he made it up. But there were other words that he would say like safi. He would say, that's enough, like safi. And this in Moroccan Arabic, and not in a Jewish Moroccan Arabic, in every Moroccan Arabic means enough. And that was what he used to say. And I didn't know it until I allowed myself to have the experience of having a non-threatening, non-colonized conversation with non-Jewish Moroccan people. This was something that we could have known about ourselves in our whole family, that could have informed how we see ourselves if we had not bought into the US idea that any Arab country you go to is going to be difficult for a Jewish person and that's dangerous. Which isn't to say that it isn't universally safe, but then the rest of the world isn't universally safe. It's just somehow we look at the supposed precarity of existence in the Arab world as one of the facades that we use to make it seem like it's such a backward, barbaric place, that deep inside, even before saying rhetorically that I am a Jewish Arab person, I thought my family comes from a precarious place. My family comes from a lowly place. And that's something that makes you feel really awful about yourself, when you're constantly told that you come from something that Professor Aziz describes at length in The Racial Muslim. In this country, we describe Arab countries as a kind of an Oriental antithesis to this supposed idea of Western Protestant liberal values, which is very much in line with how the French would position themselves in Northern Africa, and the Egyptian and the British would position themselves in Northern Africa. Something else that I have to say about that precariousness before we move on, I'm sorry, is that if Oscar was literate in Arabic and continued to read Arabic language, and Daida, my grandmother, was never literate in Arabic. My grandmother spoke Tunisian dialect with her family at home, but even her parents never knew how to write in Arabic. If Oscar was more kind of Arab identifying than my grandmother, it was not because he was a different person kind of fundamentally than Daida. It was literally because there were policy documents that from the French education system that existed in Egypt at that time. I mean, this is likely the reason why, that said, we have de-Arabized the Jewish Egyptian communities. We now need to re-Arabize them. And the likely reason behind this was because they were jockeying for power with the British at that time. They they wanted to promote ideas of Egyptian nationalism among Jewish Egyptian people at a given moment when it suited the French mission in Egypt to have them reject the British protectorate. And then the French could swoop in and fully assume this place that they had already tried to assume by inculcating rich Muslim, Christian, and Jewish people who had the money for an education in this system that taught Egyptian people that the future was elsewhere. So Oscar was part of this French-educated, re-Arabized community that began to see themselves as more integral parts of that community up until the Zionist movement then decided that they would again de-Arabize all of these people. So the way we were was decided for us, or seems to reflect a little too closely the policy documents that were written by people who decided how we would be socially and culturally from thousands of miles away from where we're actually from in Europe at a given moment when we know that these people were jockeying for influence in our parts of the world. The precariousness of our Arabness was decided by these people. The kind of chronological positionality of this book, I go through the book, I start with when we were Arabs, because I hope that through the course of the book, I show you that when we were Arabs, it's not in the past. It's not in my grandparents' past. It's immortal, like my grandparents in many ways. There are aspects of them that will continue to live on, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, in the way that I conduct myself because I have chosen their legacy. I've chosen not to forget them, even though the policy document said, forget your grandparents. Forget what was Arab about your grandparents, because the closer you are to this European ideal, the less likely it is that you'll be put into prison, like many people who didn't historically view that, many people who didn't accept Europe as the future, who were Arab nationalists, Arab democratic nationalists in our history. Jewish Tunisian people, Jewish Egyptian people were either exiled from their homelands, put in prison, or faced the retribution of the colonial order. So the opposite of that was to put yourself as close as possible to the power. That's exactly what Professor Aziz describes a lot in this book, is the way that various peoples throughout American history have sought to position themselves as close as possible to the white supremacist power of this country, and the alternatives of not doing that. She categorizes very interestingly the different kinds of Muslim American people, what happens to them when they behave exactly as the system wants them to behave, and what happens to them as retribution when they don't. The kind of total decimation, the total destruction of their lives that they face legally in this country when they don't do exactly what this new kind of social order that is established for us by people on high tells them that they must do.
Wow. Just for, thank you so much for comparing your book with mine. Interestingly, I finished mine after you finished yours, but it does show that the different ways in which subordination occurs and the role of colonialism, particularly European colonialism, plays in oppressing, right, different people and within these different hierarchies. And so I want to shift a little bit to what is effectively the post-1948 context, right? And at this point, you have something called the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? So I'm just gonna, I'm not, I know there's a whole literature on problematizing how that's framed, but I'm interested in the perspective of you as a Jewish Arab in terms of the responses of the diversity of Jewish Arabs, particularly, let's keep it to Jewish Arab Americans, which I assume is what you're most familiar with as that being kind of your most authentic identity, although feel free to also expound on global kind of Jewish Arab identity. But how the responses to the occupation of the Palestinians now for more than 50 years. And specifically, what are the, to help us understand, those of us who are not familiar with kind of that ecosystem of diversity and diverse responses to the occupation of Palestine, the Palestinians, what are the various positions or approaches adopted in response to their unique positions as Arabs who have much more culturally in common with Palestinians, but while also being Jews who are privileged due to their religious identity, whether it's in Israel itself or whether it's even in the US as part of the way that the conflict is described, because at least we could argue until very recently, although I don't necessarily agree, I do think there's a shift in how we're talking about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, but I still think that the mainstream narrative in the US absolutely privileges the Jewish perspective, or I should say the Israeli state perspective, and the Jewish perspective that supports the Israeli state policies. Because obviously there are dissidents within Israel, and there's a very robust, progressive political society and civil society there of Israeli Jews. But you don't hear a lot about the Jewish Arab perspective. So could you give us, whether you want to talk about how your book informs that, or if you want to go a little bit more broader, but I think it's a very important perspective that's lacking when we have these discussions, particularly in the US.
For me, in terms of the discussions that I have sought out as a result of this book, the majority of those discussions have been, I should back up and I should say, there are a great many people who would assume that this is a book for Jewish Arab people. This is an Arab book for Arab people that helps to inform Arabness. In terms of the different responses that I've had from Jewish Arab people, I've been surprised to see how many people feel have feelings that resonate with this book, but for whom expressing any kind of views that are not in line with either the kind of status quo that exists within this country, or even within the so-called liberal Zionist framework, have felt themselves unable to speak, or anything that they feel about their own identity, they found themselves unable to speak on it. There is very much a kind of a concerted effort to decide what we are allowed to say and what we are not allowed to say, and that's very much tied to the way that our news media infrastructure exists in this country. There are a lot of problems with the way that we cover Palestine in this country, with headlines and articles and ideas that push a kind of a false equivalency between an oppressor and the oppressed. It was very hard for Daida and for me to get this book deal. The book has done well. There was a market for this book. There were people who responded to this book. There were very specific people within the publishing kind of ecosystem in the United States who didn't want this book to exist, and who didn't even make it a secret that they didn't want this book to exist. The one that I'm most at liberty to say is there was an agent who got me on the phone in the middle of a workday to tell, and I was very excited about this. I thought, oh, okay, this project is moving forward, just to tell me that they disagreed fundamentally with my view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that they agreed that the settlements were illegal. Good for them, thank you. They're illegal objectively. But that was the extent of his support for the existence of Palestine, of Palestinian lives and of Palestinian dignity, was the settlements. And that Netanyahu was not a symptom of an overall kind of system of oppression and genocide, but Netanyahu was the problem. And that when Netanyahu went, Israel would return to being the only democracy in the Middle East, and all of these fantasies that so he had arrived at a specific level of what he viewed to be liberalism or progress, and that was measured progress, that he had decided I've given enough and I'm giving no more. And he literally told me I will never publish this book and I don't think it should be published. And I don't know what other people have to say about this identity and yada, yada, yada. Very intense conversations with this man. There were very intense conversations with actual publishers. There is a prominent liberal Zionist who recently asked the question publicly. I won't name names because I don't believe in attacking people so much as systems of oppression. This man asked why so many people, Jewish people, and they always use this construction to divorce us from our homelands. Jewish people of Arab lands, or Jewish people, Jews of Arab lands, Jews of Muslim lands, to just kind of rhetorically, psychologically, kind of subliminally extricate us from our homelands. Why are they so often so illiberal in Israel? In the context of occupied Palestine, there are a lot of questions to be asked about why people who could identify as Jewish Arabs support the brutal genocide against, the ongoing genocide against Palestinian people. Those are questions that must be asked. But why do you only hear from those people at the same time? That's another question that must be asked. Why do you only hear from those people? Because it's become very apparent to me as somebody who has made themselves an outpost for people to come to me and tell me that they have similar ideas. I hear there are a lot of very talented Arab people of Jewish origin who identify themselves as Jewish Arabs, who are 100% for the liberation of Palestine and its people, and are as eager to see the killing of people resisting their violent dispossession end immediately, not just in our generation. These are not people that we hear from. That liberal Zionist then turned to other liberal Zionists and asked them that question as though they were having some kind of a liberally minded discussion on the future of Palestine. That's one of the other problems of liberal Zionists, is that very oftentimes those discussions are among people of Jewish faith and don't include any kind of Palestinian perspective. They take it upon themselves to be a voice for Palestinian rights that always has a measured approach, that always stops short of full support for Palestinian liberation and life. It is not an act of generosity or of being too much or too extra to say Palestinian people deserve liberation without qualifications, without me saying, I support Palestinian life and liberty to the extent that it's convenient, or to the extent that it doesn't give up any of my power as somebody who is part of the system of degradation and dispossession in occupied Palestine. So what I would say is, yes, it does exist very much so, that there is a majority now of people in occupied Palestine who could identify with a legacy of Jewish Arabness or Jewish Middle Easternness more broadly. Those people, there must be some kind of a reckoning with the fact that there are these ties to the very people that you are helping to perform genocide against, that you need to be aware of. But they are aware of them where it's useful to the Israeli state. There are people who weaponize those connections when it's useful to the Israeli state in a way that reflects Oscar's re-Arabization that I describe in When We Were Arabs. At a moment when Paris found it useful for Jewish Egyptian people to see themselves as Egyptian, Oscar was Egyptian. At a moment where we see normalization deals between Morocco, my ancestral homeland, between the Emirates and Tel Aviv, at this moment where we see this relationship between them, we suddenly see Jewish Moroccan people become very Moroccan and proud to be continued subjects of the Moroccan state. And we see this kind of nationalism where people who used to degrade their family, not just their cousins, not just their Abrahamic cousins, our own people, that we're so willing to sell out our own people for the state of the continued existence of this state of oppression that we see. That when there's something to be gained for the Israeli state, they're willing to put even their own self-hating, for lack of any kind of a more nuanced way of saying it, Arabness onto public display for the sake of having it be active as a kind of an agent for this system of apartheid. So my recommendation in terms of if I had to say I want something different is I want for there to be more Arab media. I want for there to be more media that is owned by Arab and Arab American people, that is our voices, edited by our voices, that says what we need to say for ourselves. There are people who do that. I would prefer for that media not to be tied to any state actor. In terms of my own experience of state media and state Arabness or state Arabism, it's never worked. It's never been for me. Arabness is a person-to-person thing that I experience. It's a movement among people. That's part of the reason why, thankfully, with When We Were Arabs, I had the opportunity to go with publishers who were more in the so-called mainstream, and had the opportunity to work with a North African Arab publisher based out of Britain, Darf Publishers. There are people, there's Interlink Publishers in the United States, it's a Palestinian American owned publisher. There are people who are starting their own websites. Start a website. If you're Arab American, or if you are an ally of Arab Americans, help to build these systems where we are allowed to tell our own stories without a lens of somebody who makes it polite, who makes it for polite society, who tones. One literary agent who I spoke to for When We Were Arabs told me to literally, and I quote, tone down the Palestine of When We Were Arabs to make it saleable, to make it presentable to whatever kind of Jewish book organizations could help put it front and center to people, so that they could make money off of it. That was in 2016. That's in present day United States. Tone down the Palestine. This isn't even a book on Palestine. So, to a certain extent, I do ask myself sometimes if it's harder for somebody saying something about Palestine who isn't Palestinian, or who is in this particular situation of belonging to both an ethnicity and a faith group that constitute a large part of Israeli society. If it's harder for me to say certain things, but then I think every single time when I get a message from somebody in my Instagram inbox who's angry and doesn't really care because they're so angry that I am going to report their account or whatever I end up doing to them, or blocking them or whatever. It's hard. It's hard for you to insult my parents and to tell me disgraceful things, or to tell me that I'm dirty or whatever, things that people have told me in general about myself. But it'll never be harder than living in occupied Palestine, or living as a refugee from the occupation of Palestine. It will never be that difficult. Anything that any of you, and I'm sure that among some of the participants, because there are enough of you, and thank you very much for tuning in, there are some of you who really hate me. Anything that you can say or do will never be as bad to me as the things that we see happening in occupied Palestine. And so it'll never stop. So it gets us nowhere for you to
as we say in Arabic, as we say in Arabic, Massoud, اخبطوا براسكم في الحيطة.
وإرحوا المني. And or just keep on keeping on. It's all good. It's all good. Bring it.
Right.
Bring it.
Right. So I have one more last question, and then we've got some questions in the Q&A. And if others in the participants want to add, please do. We can't answer all the questions, but we'll try. The final question, which does tie into what I research, is the role of race, again, accepting that race is a social construction, and that in the US, it's a master category. It's not necessarily a master category in other societies. But if race is a surrogate or a a synonym for kind of the European supremacy, which certainly European colonialism has dominated the social and political and economic structures, right, of the Middle East and North Africa. And that has affected, all faith communities, including the Jewish faith community. And the state of Israel is a very diverse demographic state because Jews have been, are indigenous to so many different places in the world for various historical reasons. And so how do how did this kind of what you wrote about in the book or your experiences or experiences of your grandparents, how can we understand the intra-Jewish community hierarchies that are shaped by European dominance and European supremacy complexes? Because, it certainly affects Arab American communities, it certainly affects Muslim American communities. I mean, Muslim American communities, we're talking about anti-Black racism within our own communities, right? And even the hierarchy and the tensions between South Asian American Muslims and Arab American Muslims and different origins of Arab American Muslims. I mean, this is a human condition. And so it would just not be accurate to presume that doesn't exist also within the diverse Jewish community. And so keeping in mind that Zionism is a European project, right? And that anti-Semitism, at least as we understand it, is a European problem, right? And so how does that affect, again, how does these, for shorthand, racial hierarchies, how does that affect kind of your Jewish Arab American identity? And how did it affect your grandparents who were raised in North Africa, and just generally helping us understand that?
Sure. Something as you speak that I'm recalling, and I think I did mention this in When We Were Arabs, was in Hebrew school when I was young. There was a song from Israel that they used to use to teach us how to speak Hebrew, and it was, I think it's called Kulanu Yehudim, and I think it means all of us are Jews, and it goes Kulanu Yehudim mikol minei tzvaim. And it means all of us are Jews from all different colors. Yehudim b'mea achuz, 100% Jewish. Gam hashvarza v'gam havuzvuz. And both the shvarza, which is a traditional Yiddish term that was used toward Jewish people from the non-West, so that includes Jewish Arab people, Jewish Persians, Jewish Turks, Jewish people from all over the world, and there are so many that I'm erasing also by not listing them, the Jewish Chinese who exist until today without us talking about them, and a great many other peoples. And gam havuzvuz, and also the vuzvuz is like a linguistic, it's making fun of Yiddish. The Yiddish language sounded to Jewish non-Yiddish speakers like they were saying vuz, kind of in the way that Berbers are now called Berber, because to the original Arab people who engaged in their conquest of North Africa, the Berber language sounded like Berber. There's so much that's wrong with this song. One of the things that's wrong with this song is that the very man who wrote this song ended up causing a scandal in Israeli society, because he said in an interview that Moroccan people were missing a gene, or that they were not genetically evolved like Ashkenazi Jewish people. He was of, I believe, a Polish background. And he said that Jewish Moroccan people were unevolved. And this was the man who wrote the song, who wrote into existence the idea of Israeli diversity, the idea that all of these people were treated as Jewish equally, regardless of their color. Even this racial epithet and this linguistic kind of reaction to racism of what people who were classed as Schwarze, as Black in Yiddish, used to call them in reaction, since they very much came from countries where whiteness, where fairness was considered to be wonderful. Within the context of kind of this European and projected skin color hierarchy, My grandfather had a sister who was very dark, whose family thought that she was therefore unmarriageable. And they often told her, put yogurt on her face, all kinds of stuff like that to make her look more presentable or more beautiful in what Alexandria considered to be beautiful in the 1930s and 40s. There were people who were more easily able to put themselves closer to a white supremacist colonial project than other people. And then there were people who continued to try to do that even if they looked kind of ridiculous doing it. And so that affected people within the context of occupied Palestine, and then kind of anecdotally in things that I've seen among people of our similar background. The people who were less able to do it, it almost seems kind of inversely related. The less likely you were, based on your phenotype, to be able to put yourself close to that white supremacist power, or to pass or to present in that kind of a way, the more likely you were to try to shoehorn yourself into it, to explain it away, and to put yourself closer to the power in a way that deserves blame, but that also you have to be conscious of the fact that you can't victim blame for that kind of thing. These people are putting themselves closer to the power because they see what happens to people who are not, who don't have that opportunity to be closer to the power. In terms of the way that it exists within the occupied Palestine framework, there are a lot of instances where I read or I come across an article that says that there are no longer any kind of, there's no longer any kind of racial discrimination within the context of Jewish Israeli society. That's patently untrue. We see organizations that have done research that proves the opposite, that even though Palestinians remain the target, the focal point of all of the kind of genocidal, anti-human behavior that we see in the context of occupied Palestine, there is still rampant socioeconomic discrimination against people from non-European Jewish backgrounds that disadvantages them in the context of that society. And then there is, of course, the most telling example of what happens in this kind of society that's premised on racism, on institutionalized racism. And that's, there are on occasion instances where people who are Jewish are mistaken for Palestinian people and are face the violence of either the state or militias who are backed by the Israeli state. And they end up saying the most ridiculous and telling things like, this is how you treat a Palestinian person. I'm not Palestinian. They say things that very, you can read, there are news articles that talk about this, Google around, it's not hard to find. There are instances where these people react to instances of state-sponsored violence or state violence with, I was mistaken for a Palestinian, as if to suggest, or literally just suggesting, this is how you treat a Palestinian. This is not how you treat me. I have privilege over this. Allegedly in the context of this society, I have privilege over this. That's also reminiscent, and I was thinking about this a lot with the racial Muslim, of at the beginning of the Trump administration, I was still reporting for Al Jazeera at the time, I was going to the airport, and very often I would end up interviewing Christian Arab people who would say, I was treated like a Muslim. I have nothing to do with Islam. Then there were, and just the way of saying that, just I understood what they were saying, and I understood that on the tail end of a traumatizing experience of being locked in secondary confinement in an airport, that you would come out and let it rip and just not really care what you were saying, but the racism card was just out. And there was in several circumstances, there were people who were Jewish, who were raced, as Professor Aziz writes it in her book, as Arab, and were barred from entry to the United States. So there was a man of Israeli nationality, I remember, who was of Yemeni origin. he was turned away at the border at the onset of the Muslim ban. There was another Jewish Egyptian who was from, he was a scholar who I believe was from the Ashkenazi Jewish community from Egypt, who was a European who was from Egypt, who is of Jewish faith, who is a scholar who was coming to the United States for some kind of symposium, who was also turned away at the border by virtue of his connection to the Egyptian state. And so the thing is, it's always interesting to see that all of this is premised on a logical fallacy, that there is some kind of a science or a logic to the racism or colorism or what have you of these societies, the US, Israel, that are premised on racism fundamentally. It's always my mistake, really, to assume that there should be a logic. It's always the mistake of the people who end up saying wildly bigoted things like, I'm not Muslim, go do this to Muslim people. This kind of treatment is okay for Muslim people. It's not okay for me. I'm tangentially related to them. Culturally, we share a lot. Culturally, a lot of how my family has its roots in the culture of Islam. That's also an important thing for me to say. Oscar was kind of a passively Zionist person, and I say that clearly in this book. He deserves, we have responsibility, we should take responsibility in our family for being part of this genocidal project. But fundamentally, Oscar realized that there's nothing about Islam that is so separate from our religion, that if something is true in both faiths, he'd feel like, oh, that's good that it's true also in Islam. Or if Islam is part of how we are. This book, When We Were Arabs, would not exist if it weren't for the teachings of Islam that have influenced my life as a non-Muslim Jewish person, for whom Islam, the culture of justice in Islam, of not putting people who are oppressed in a lower position than they are, which is something I think that is endemic to Arab societies, regardless of your faith, and that is rooted in the teachings of Islam. That was very much something that I was taught by my Jewish Arab grandparents. There are a lot of things about the way that Islam describes finance, especially Islamic finance. I'm especially interested in the idea of how you don't push people further and further down in Islam with finances that burden poor people, that were very much in line with how we are in our family, that have roots in Judaism, but that are Arab cultural things that I think have their roots in a sense of dignity and haqq that is true to our societies from Morocco to Oman. So it wasn't an idea that Oscar had necessarily, that Islam was so different that he would have distanced himself from Islam, but he would have done it for self-preservation in a way that these people that we see at the onset of the Trump administration ended up saying, I'm not a Muslim. That happened very often with Oscar in particular at the beginning of 9/11, that he saw that there was a member of our synagogue community had brought over a cousin who was still living in Morocco, and that after the Patriot Act, he was deported back to Morocco, and and everybody was up in arms saying, how did this possibly happen? Did they not know that he was Jewish? And so this kind of colored how Oscar was in general after 9/11, was this idea that your citizenship can be dissolved very easily, and that we are only here by the grace of the Protestant white American people who allow us to be here, and that we better be very quiet about the Arab identity, about our belonging to any place, definitely not go back to Egypt, even though so many times he wanted to take me back to Egypt. That was his dream. Anyway, thank you.
Much, Massoud.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Massoud. This was, you did not disappoint at all.
Oh,
this
thank
is
you.
exactly what I expected. And I think the chat shows that You were critical, you were challenging, you were radical in a complementary way. And I think you've really caused many of us to think more deeply and think in a different way and through a different lens than what we're normally exposed to or accustomed to. And congratulations again on publishing When We Were Arabs. We look forward to your 2 books this year, inshallah.
Inshallah.
And I hope that everybody who was able to participate today, if you haven't already read When We Were Arabs, please do purchase it and read it. It's definitely a tour de force. So mabruk, yeah, mabruk really.
And read this book. Read this book. I'm not saying I wouldn't have said anything. I wouldn't have said anything if I didn't feel it in my chest. This is the most intellectual stimulation that I've had in some time of living a very kind of. It really is. It will make you at several junctures be like, I wish she would do this for France in a French election year, and I wish that she would do it for China and for other places where there needs a holistic approach to understand the injustices that we're seeing today in the environment of potential human catastrophe premised on xenophobia and hatred and Islamophobia that we're seeing today. So read it.
Thank you, Massoud.
And I hope that we have conversations like this in LA. Come to LA. Let's do it in person.
Inshallah.
And I had fun. Inshallah.
And so before I formally close, I just want to again thank you, Massoud. Thank you to our participants. And please do fill out the event form, feedback form. There's a link, it's very short. And finally, if you have the ability to donate, please do. We depend on donations. We want to keep our programs public and free, and we want to continue to be a platform for important voices like Massoud Hayoun. We want to show the people who impose upon themselves this gatekeeping role to try to keep us from being exposed to different books and different movies and different ideas, that we will compete with them. And we will bring these voices and these perspectives, and particularly voices of Arabs and Muslims and South Asians in all of those diverse identities, whether it's ethnic diversity, religious diversity, racial diversity, immigrant status diversity. So please go to csrr.rutgers.edu, make a donation, and follow us on social media at RUCSRR, on Instagram at RutgersCSRR. And our next discussion, our next lecture is going to be on March 8th with Professor Edward Curtis IV, who will be presenting his book, Muslims in the Heartland, the story of Syrian migration to the Midwest in the United States. And so that is sure to be another very interesting and provocative talk, of which we hope to see all of you there, inshallah. Okay, shukran ya Massoud, virtual clap, and ma salama everybody. Thank you very much.